I never thought working the night shift at an ice cream shop would be anything more than a simple, quiet job. After all, what could go wrong at a place that sold chocolate cones and rainbow sprinkles to kids? But by the time my shift began that night, I'd learned one important lesson. The night always hides something darker than you expect. The ice cream shop I worked at was in a small strip mall, tucked away in the corner of town. It had been a thriving spot just a few years ago, a place where teenagers and families came to grab a cone after dinner. But slowly, as the years passed, other businesses in the mall shut down one by one. The thrift store, the nail salon, and the small coffee shop. They all vanished, leaving only our shop and a few boarded-up windows. At night it was just us, the lonely ice cream parlor, glowing under the flickering streetlight in the parking lot. The shop was busiest earlier in the evening, but by the time my shift started at 10 p.m., the place was quiet. I spent the first half hour cleaning up after the previous shift, wiping counters and restocking the tubs of ice cream. The hours dragged on as I shuffled behind the counter, alone except for the soft hum of the freezers. The silence began to feel heavier, almost suffocating. Around midnight, I heard the soft jingle of the front door. A small group of high schoolers entered, laughing and joking as they made their way to the counter. They were the typical late-night crowd, kids looking for something sweet before heading to a nearby park. I served them their cones, made small talk, and watched them leave as quickly as they came, their laughter fading into the night. The shop was empty again. The parking lot outside was almost completely deserted, with only a few parked cars scattered near the abandoned stores. The only noise now was the occasional creak of the building settling. I glanced at the clock, 1 a.m. I could feel the fatigue settling in. The only thing that broke the stillness was the occasional sound of footsteps from the far end of the strip mall, where the businesses were shuttered and dark. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or some stray animal. But the noises seemed to get closer, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. At 1:30, I decided to take out the trash. The dumpster was at the far corner of the parking lot, near one of the abandoned storefronts. I grabbed the bag, bundled it up, and stepped outside into the crisp, cool air. The parking lot seemed even more desolate in the moonlight, the single street light flickering above. My footsteps echoed too loudly in the stillness as I made my way to the back of the lot. Just as I was about to throw the bag in the dumpster, I noticed something strange. A light, faint but unmistakable, was coming from one of the abandoned buildings. It looked like a flashlight, moving erratically, as if someone was inside, searching for something. I froze. Maybe it was nothing. Perhaps it was just someone who had decided to break into the empty shop, or maybe a few kids were sneaking around. But something about the way the light moved. It didn't seem casual. It seemed deliberate. Someone was looking for something, or someone. My heart started to race. I hurried back to the shop, hands shaking as I locked the door behind me. I tried to brush off the feeling that something was wrong, but the unease lingered in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't shake the image of that light dancing through the darkness. At 2:10 a.m., I heard the doorbell chime again. I looked up to see a man standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light outside. He was in his early 40s, wearing a worn-out jacket with frayed sleeves. His hair was greasy and his beard was unkempt, as if he hadn't shaved in days. The smell hit me first, a sour, pungent odor like sweat and something else I couldn't place. He didn't say anything as he stepped inside. He didn't even look at the menu. He just stood there, staring at me with cold, hollow eyes. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond. Instead, his gaze shifted from the menu to the back of the shop where the storage area was. He stared at it for a long moment, an unsettling smile spreading across his face. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was slow, deliberate, like he was savoring some private joke. Then, without a word, he turned and left, walking out of the shop and disappearing into the night. A cold chill settled over me. I locked the door behind him, my heart pounding. I glanced out the window trying to spot him in the parking lot, but he was already gone. Had he been following me? Why had he looked at the back door like that? I needed a break. I decided to sit in my car for a while, where I could lock the doors and get some distance. I grabbed my lunch, stepped outside, and slid into the driver's seat, keeping the engine running to keep warm. The silence outside felt unnaturally heavy, like the entire world had gone still. Then I saw them. Two figures emerged from behind the far end of the building. One was the man from earlier, and the other was a smaller figure carrying something in their hand. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but it looked like a flashlight or maybe a crowbar. My stomach twisted. They were walking straight toward the shop. I ducked down in my seat, heart racing, my breath shallow. The last thing I wanted was for them to spot me in my car, so I stayed as still as possible, praying they wouldn't see me. But they didn't hesitate. They went straight to the entrance and walked right in. I pulled out my phone, hands trembling, and dialed 911. I whispered into the phone, "Two men just entered my shop. I think they're looking for me. Please hurry." From the window, I watched them. They didn't act like robbers. They weren't grabbing cash or rummaging through the freezers. They were searching. First, they looked behind the counter, rifling through the drawers. Then they moved to the back room, peeking behind boxes and shelves. It was as if they knew exactly what they were looking for, or maybe who. I watched in horror as they rushed out a few minutes later, disappearing into the shadows. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't know what to do, so I stayed in the car, my eyes darting back and forth between the parking lot and my phone. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Across the parking lot, near the dumpster, one of the men was crouching behind a pile of discarded boxes, watching the shop. He was waiting, watching for me to come back inside. Just then, the wail of sirens filled the air. The man shot up and bolted, disappearing around the side of the building just as the flashing red and blue lights flooded the lot. The police were here. I felt a rush of relief, but it was quickly replaced by a lingering sense of dread. Where had they gone? And why had they been watching me so intently? The officers arrived moments later and searched the area, but the men were long gone. They did find something, though. A busted door leading into one of the abandoned shops. They confirmed the men had been hiding there for a while, watching, waiting for something. As I sat in my car, still shaking, one of the officers knocked on my window, startling me. "Do you know these men?" he asked. I shook my head. "Number," but they knew I was here. The officer looked concerned. "We found this behind the counter." He led me inside, where I saw a single scoop of ice cream in a cup sitting on the counter, slowly melting. I hadn't served anyone in hours. A chill ran through me. They had been inside before I even saw them. They had been watching, waiting. I never went back to that shop. I couldn't. I still don't know what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. If I hadn't decided to take my break when I did, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. I had always dreamed of living alone, away from the noise and chaos of the city. I never imagined how much I would crave peace until I was drowning in constant distractions. Traffic, sirens, loud neighbors. So when the opportunity arose to buy a cabin deep in the woods, far from everything, I jumped on it without hesitation. The place was tucked away in a dense forest somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains. The nearest town was miles away, a tiny dot on a map. It seemed perfect. Just a small cabin with a wraparound porch and a crackling fireplace. No cell signal, no internet. Just me, the trees, and silence. At first, it was everything I wanted. I woke up every morning to the chirping of birds and the rustle of the wind in the trees. My only company was the occasional squirrel darting across the porch, or the soft thud of a deer's hooves on the forest floor. The nights were even quieter, save for the distant howl of a coyote or the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But soon, I noticed something strange. I would often wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding as though I was being watched. At first, I chalked it up to the nerves of being in an unfamiliar place. It didn't help that I had been living in the city for so long that my sense of peace felt fragile, easily disturbed. But the feeling never went away. I installed a motion sensor light at the front of the cabin, thinking it might make me feel safer. I didn't know what I was expecting to see. Maybe a bear, maybe a raccoon. But I never anticipated the figure I saw that first night. I woke up to the soft click of the motion sensor light flicking on. I sat up in bed, heart racing. Through the window, I saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching the cabin. They were too far away for me to make out details, but there was no mistaking the feeling of eyes staring at me. I tried to shake it off. It was probably just a hiker, or some lost soul looking for help. But when I opened the door to check, there was no one there. The woods were still, and the light eventually turned off again, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight illuminating the trees. The next night, I heard it again. A soft thud against the side of the cabin, followed by a faint whisper, like someone was trying to speak just loud enough for me to hear. My heart was in my throat as I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, the cold air stinging my skin. I could feel it. Someone was close. I shined the light around the porch, then out into the yard. Nothing. Only the swaying of the trees and the distant echo of a falling branch. Then, as I turned back toward the cabin, I saw it. In the corner of my eye, just outside the tree line, there he was again, the figure. I froze. I couldn't make out his face, but he was there. And just like before, when I looked back, he was gone. The next few days were the same. I tried to go about my business, convincing myself I was just imagining things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I stepped outside, I felt as if someone was following me just out of sight. Every rustle in the woods, every snap of a twig, sent me jumping out of my skin. I decided to talk to the neighbors, even though the closest one lived miles away. I had seen a small house down the trail, half hidden by the trees. Maybe they knew something. When I arrived at their cabin, I met a man named Frank. He was older, in his 60s, with a thick beard and deep-set eyes. I asked him if anyone else lived in the woods, if anyone had been around my cabin. He gave me a long, searching look before shaking his head. "You're not alone out there, but you won't find what you're looking for," he said cryptically. I tried to press him further, but he only repeated the same phrase, his voice low, as though he were warning me. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt that familiar, oppressive presence again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just a feeling of being watched. It felt like someone was standing just inches from me. I could almost hear their breath. I grabbed my flashlight again and ran outside, my pulse hammering in my ears. I shone the light across the yard into the trees, but I saw nothing until I heard it. A soft voice coming from behind me. "You're not supposed to be here." I whipped around, my heart dropping into my stomach. A woman stood just beyond the porch, her face hidden in shadows. She was tall, thin, with long, tangled hair. Her clothes were ragged, and her eyes, oh, those eyes, were wide, wild, like she hadn't slept in days. I couldn't move. The words froze in my throat. She stepped closer, her voice growing louder. "They're watching. Always watching." Before I could say anything, she turned and disappeared into the trees, her voice echoing in the distance. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed up and left the cabin. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. The sense of being watched was too much. I didn't feel safe anymore. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone in the woods, but I didn't. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something lurking just out of sight. It's been weeks since I left, but every now and then, I hear that voice in the back of my mind. "You're not supposed to be here?" I can't help but wonder. If I go back, will they be waiting for me?